My name is Jeff Rosenberg. I'm today's moderator. I'm the Mississippi Gulf Coast National Heritage Area Historical Preservation Coordinator. We've got some very interesting paper presentations today, and I'm going to go ahead and read the bios for all of our presenters today, and then I'm going to turn the microphone over to them. So our first presenter today is Andrew Gardner. Drew Gardner is a museum educator at the two Mississippi museums. Before that, he spent 7 years in education, the last 4 years of which teaching elementary and middle school history at the Redeemers School in Jackson. Currently, he is pursuing his Master of Arts degree at Jackson State University, where his research focuses on the intersectionality of race and religion in Mississippi. In addition, he is working on projects with Mississippi History Now, the Civil War and Reconstruction Governors of Mississippi, and the Office of Community Engagement at Jackson State University. Our next paper will be presented by Thomas Kersen, titled Theosophical Endeavors in the Magnolia State. Tom Kersen is an associate professor of sociology at Jackson State University. In 2021, he was awarded the Mississippi Humanities Teacher of the Year for Jackson State University by the Humanities Council. He also served 2 terms as president for the Alabama-Mississippi Sociological Association and held other leadership positions in that organization. Thomas wrote a number of peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and most recently the book Where the Misfits Fit, published by the University of Mississippi Press, which won the Stanford M. Lyman Distinguished Book Award in 2021. Kersen received his PhD in 2003 from Mississippi State University. He is also a retired medical service corps officer, Army Medical Service Corps officer. And last but not least is Alan Wheat with his paper entitled Murder in a Small Town, The Forgotten Story of Mack Charles Carter. Al has a bachelor's in social studies license from the University of Southern Mississippi and is currently getting his master's in history at Jackson State University. He is the 2021 recipient of the Margaret Walker Award for the best essay on Black experience in the American South. Wheat taught history and technology courses in Mississippi public schools for 7 years before leaving for his current career as the Director of Education at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. So I hope that you will enjoy the presentations offered today, and I will turn it over to our first speaker, Drew.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you, Jeff, again. For the introduction, as Jeff mentioned, my name is Drew Gardner. I serve on the education team at the 2 Mississippi museums, and I'm a second-year graduate student at Jackson State University. Where my research does, it focuses on the intersectionality, specifically of Protestantism and religion here in Mississippi. As Mississippi entered the Union, only 1 in 20 of the state's roughly 45,000 free white adults were members of a Christian church. As Mississippi's population explodes during the 1830s, religious organizations across the nation are going to dispatch missionaries to the state. And by the eve of the Civil War, Christian church membership among white Mississippians is going to increase by over 5,000%. A majority of which are going to worship in one of the 1,200 Methodist, Baptist, or Presbyterian churches. During this tremendous religious expansion in Mississippi, the topic of enslavement dominates pulpits across the United States and especially here in Mississippi. My research that I'm going to present today focuses on the cultural, the economic, the political, and the theological circumstances in which Mississippi's pre-Civil War Southern white Protestant congregations established themselves. For the sake of time, I'm going to move kind of quickly through the first half of my presentation. It's going to focus in on the geographic, the social, the economic, and the political settings that molded these assemblies, so I can spend a little more time talking about the theological dilemma that engulfed Christian institutions across in Mississippi and across the nation. Now, I've used this term once, and so I want to kind of define it using Kenneth Bailey's definition of Southern White Protestantism. These were the most numerically significant denominations in the 19th century that continues into the 20th century. Kenneth Bailey has an excellent text on Southern White Protestantism in the 20th century that kind of provides this foundational definition. Not only were these the most significant in the nation, but also especially in Mississippi. And these three congregations, when I use that language of Southern White Protestants, I'm referring to the Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian churches across the state. Now, as I continue on, this first half, like I said, is going to focus in on these, kind of what I refer to as the soil. If we think of assemblies, if we think of churches, if we think of these religious institutions as a means of a tree, that's kind of the analogy I like to use, something that is living, something that is moving, changing, dying, growing. If we think of them as such in the cultural, the economic, the political, and even the theological circumstances in which those institutions are created, that's the soil in which they are planted. The research I'm going to present today is going to contend that these Mississippi pre-Civil War Southern White Protestant assemblies planted themselves in a soil poisoned by race-based chattel slavery. The institution of slavery is going to define the state's borders, influence its Union entrance, build its economic infrastructure, generate population growth, determine political power, and infect the theological tenets of these congregations in Mississippi. Going through very quickly with just kind of a quick overview of how I say that this soil is infected by slavery. I'm going to go through just a couple of quick points to spend a little bit more time in my research, but for the sake of time, I'm going to go through a little fast. Prior to Mississippi's organization as a territory, little was known about this region referred to as the Yazoo that encompassed land all the way from the Mississippi River to the Chattahoochee River. However, there becomes this large desire amongst land speculators and other investors across the nation to take this fertile land and to use it to sculpt this land with enslaved labor. And the hope that the labor would generate significant profits from the commodities and the sale of those enslaved peoples. Now, prominent land speculators, such as the Georgia-Mississippi Land Company, they believed that this 35 million acres were so profitable they would even go as far to commit fraud and bribe the Georgia state officials to secure a land deal. Again, all of this land value being based off of the reality that it would be sculpted by enslaved laborers. We know in 1798, this region, the Yazoo, is going to become the Mississippi Territory, originally engulfing all of present-day Mississippi, as well as the state of Alabama and even portions of West Florida. However, two decades after territory establishment, we know that a much smaller Mississippi is actually admitted as the 20th state of the Union in 1817. Now, admitting this smaller state of Mississippi and neglecting, or at least not including, the eastern portion of the state was, and the statement from William Lattimore, the territorial representative at the time, was favorable within national politics because it allowed for a future slave state out of what eventually will become Alabama. Now, this congressional legislation between Mississippi's border and its entrance into the Union are going to be tied with this national political desire to maintain parity between northern free states and southern slave states. We know Indiana is going to become a state the year before Mississippi in 1816, and this is going to press, it's going to send the Union out of balance in sense of number of free and enslaved states, and we're going to see Mississippi's Union entrance fast-tracked, followed by Illinois to follow Mississippi, and then obviously the state of Alabama. These borders, the entrance, they're all tied into the reality of slavery and how it plays in Mississippi and across the nation. Now, within the first 2 decades of statehood, there's a massive population shift in this land formerly known as the Yazoo. It becomes a primary destination for white Americans seeking opportunity. A lot of this will hinge after the 1830 Indian Removal Act. From 1820 to 1830, you're going to see an 81% increase in population in Mississippi. Again, from 1830 to 1840, the population is going to almost double. And again, between 1840 and 1850, another nearly doubling of the population. And by 1840, enslaved black and brown Mississippians are going to make up the majority of the state's population. Again, these being enslaved peoples, this growth that's happening, population being built off of the reality of enslavement. Now, in tandem with this population growth, comes quickly, Mississippi becomes one of the primary producers of cotton throughout the United States. Numerically, Mississippi was a small state. However, it was home to some of the richest cotton planters in the South. Race-based chattel slavery is going to build, again, the economic framework of Mississippi. According to historian W.B. Hamilton, in his 1820 research, he states that enslaved laborers comprised approximately $13 million of financial security. Hamilton quotes, "It was all take and no give. Any profits or apparent profits were reinvested in more land to mine or slaves to breed for the owner to have more slaves to sell." End quote. Mississippi is going to neglect sustainable enterprises such as banking, insurance corporations, manufacturing companies, educational systems, and public health, and instead it's the domestic slave trade and the commodities produced by enslaved laborers are going to constitute the singular and primary capital investment of the state. Adjusted to annual rates of inflation, that $13 million in 1820 values north of $250 billion in 2019. That's twice the gross domestic product of the state of Mississippi in 2019. Again, capitalistic fervor is sustained by an exploitative and abusive institution of slavery is going to propel Mississippi in their economic foundation. Now I'm going to talk just quickly about the 1830 Constitution. I usually like to spend more time, but for time's sake, I'm going to go quickly. Historian Wesley Busby talks about in his History of Mississippi text, claiming that Mississippi's Constitution of 1832 was one of the most democratic constitutions in the South during Jacksonian democracy. However, we know that those democratic principles were not provided to nearly half of the population, roughly 66,000 enslaved peoples. Again, in 1830, Mississippi had the opportunity to address a national conversation that was especially happening in Christian institutions about the institution of slavery and its biblical justification. Mississippi representatives are going to reaffirm the institution of slavery, their singular and most valuable human investment. Now, moving into where I want to spend more of my time speaking on how these realities manifest themselves within religious institutions, specifically these Southern white Protestant institutions. As Mississippi's population exploded, like I explained earlier in the 1830s, these religious organizations, they're going to dispatch missionaries across the nation to Mississippi to instruct the state's unchurched hearts and souls. Historian Mark Knoll is going to use this language of direction, purpose, meaning, and stability as a means of why Christian revivals and local faith-based communities, alongside a clothing of some Republican language, attracted both black and white Mississippians. And by 1860, approximately a third of the state's white adults are going to now claim Christian church membership. This increased activity among Southern white Protestant institutions is going to present clergy members with an opportunity to wield a divine authority. For some ministers, a degree of material and prestige and power is going to follow along with, often manifesting itself in some significant financial wealth. In his book, Religion in Mississippi, Randy Sparks notes that as evangelicals moved up the socioeconomic ladders, many of the town ministers became quite wealthy. They moved along with them. In the case of in Natchez, Reverend Perry Chase had an estate valued in 1860 at $65,000. That sum today equates over $2 million of financial wealth. A couple of counties over, Reverend James Smiley, who established the Mississippi Presbytery in 1815, he's going to amass a wealth that include over 1,000 acres, and he's also going to own the largest number of enslaved peoples in Mack County. Now, not all priests attained such an elevated means. However, their influence was nonetheless. In Mark Knoll's text, The Civil War as a Theological Crisis, he explains how Protestant congregations and ministers, they achieved prominence not just through these financial means, but also by rejecting traditional authorities and judging them as vice, as corruption, as tyrannical politics, as a collapse of the social order, and encouraging and embracing forms of republicanism during this period of Jacksonian democracy that embraced virtuous character and action, political liberty for a flourishing society. In other words, American Christianity is going to pace with the nation's Republican evolution. This young country celebrated the individualistic ideas of the Enlightenment and discarded any application of traditional power. This combination of spiritual direction and Republican language is going to enliven many of its citizens and in some ways provide almost an unyielding bond between ministers and American Christians attending these congregations. As ministers grew in power and influence, the debate over slavery raged across the United States. Protestant Christians had long disagreed on numerous different topics, but the biblical scriptures and their authority had long been a fundamental tenet. And still, as the Civil War nears, the subject of slavery is going to divide Christians across the nation. The Enlightenment Board practice of personal biblical interpretation cripples a unified Christian response to enslavement. The absence of this mutual authority resulted in American Christians' impotence to settle theological disputes.
Story to be told, and that will be probably my second book dealing with counterculture in Mississippi and Alabama. And I had kind of talked about this issue a little bit, not this issue, but this topic a few years ago, talking about communal, a catalog of communal activity in Mississippi, looking at the Grand Age Colony, which was a socialist colony in the 1890s, and then also up in the Winona area, there was a socialist newspaper. And then, of course, Fairhope is not socialist, it's single tax, and then when you go down beneath Memphis, there was a single tax colony in Wall Hill, Mississippi. So there's just lots and lots to be learned about this area. Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you. And you can't see that, but this is one of the interesting things about this particular topic is chapter in my Where Misfits Fit deals with paranormal activity. And one of the interesting things about paranormal activity was inherently interesting to me, and I had been to a UFO conference, and everyone, front, back, sides, was telling me how they were going to abduct it and whatnot. And I'm scribbling, writing all this down. And so I thought, because I'm in Mississippi, what about Mississippi? And so it's really interesting because the paranormal life that exists here, or however you want to describe it, is much different than what you would find up in the Ozarks. It's UFOs up in the Ozarks. Here is palm reading, and as I was driving down 49, I want to stop every time and go to that palm reader and ask questions, those types of things. But it's that kind. So you have two kinds of paranormal activity. But this Theosophy, I just was so sure there was not going to be that happening in Alabama and Mississippi. And I've come to find out it's happening in Alabama and Mississippi and not the Ozarks. So this is a little bit of that story. I'll move past this. If you're interested in the slides or anything I'm doing, just let me know and I'll get it to you. So how many of you know what Theosophy is? Okay.
That's why you're here.
That's why I'm here. And I'm not going to read this. I'm just going to tell you some of the sociological things dealing with Theosophy, and then also some of the beliefs that are really interesting. So one of the beliefs is reincarnation. reincarnation is a big thing. And if you look at Protestantism, as Andrew was talking about, reincarnation is not a Christian concept. It isn't. But somehow they make it work. And with Theosophies, what they do is they blend in. They're syncretic. They blend in all sorts of faiths. And they're very smart, too. They say, okay, what do we have in the landscape around us? Masons. So they fit all the ideas for masonry into it, and they bring people aboard doing that. But reincarnation is one. Everybody has an Akashic record, if I pronounce that right. So an Akashic record, every one of you, and I included, were a princess or a king, because every one of them, when you look at these people, when they tell their stories, oh yes, I was a princess or a king, or down the line to where I am now. The reason why this is interesting to me is because when I was looking at the UFO experience in the Ozarks, a lot of the people who said that there were flying saucers coming in 47, all the way through the early 50s, they were influenced by Theosophy, the Theosophical tradition. This is like Far Eastern, hippie stuff that you know about from the 60s, the Moonies and all that stuff. This was going on before that. Some other things. So Theosophy, sociologically speaking, it tends to be people who are well off, women in power. Women are prevalent here in leadership. And also, too, they're looking to kind of expand their horizons. And they also have their center in India. So this is back in the 19th century. They put their their international center in India. And so this is kind of very different than most other religions. And so again, I was thinking, no way can this be in Mississippi. Just no way. And two, the other thing, so talk about syncretic now as I think about it, is they think all, like Jesus and Buddha and all these other things, they're like cosmic brothers. This is where the UFO stuff comes into play. So these are cosmic brothers. They're going to enlighten us. And when I went to that UFO conference, they said the same thing. So it's that same theosophical notion. Instead of the second coming being Jesus, it's these cosmic brothers. And the age of Aquarius will come to pass, and we'll learn from them how to make flying saucers, like Ezekiel. Because that was one of the original tests we didn't follow too closely, according to some of these folks. I know that you're laughing, but these folks believe it. They believe it. And again, it's like, wow, it's not going to happen in Mississippi. It's just not going to happen. And so a mystic speaker tried to come down and gauge the landscape a little bit to see if this was a viable option. And it was Mary Jane Wilkinson. And so what she did is you can see here, she came down here and she spoke, she went into a trance, is how many of them back in the 19th century would do. And in this trance, what they would say is a whole bunch of things that would please the audience and gain members. And so, but she said something about Mississippi and the South in general, her feelings. And it was it's so warm that the mediumship, that the ether or whatever it is that's in the South, will not allow for transmission of paranormal stuff. And you can see that right there. But what happened was really she didn't persuade the audience as what was going on. And so they were trying to make inroads here in the South. They did have a presence in New Orleans and other places, in big centers. But you're going to see that this, more so with Baker here saying this, after the Civil War, you start to see some of this Far Eastern paranormal stuff going on, and isms of all sorts, socialism, like I said, in the 1890s in the Grand Range colonies. So the ground starts to become a little more fertile for different thoughts, different ways of expressing religious beliefs. Now, for Josephine Cable's Aldrich, this is really interesting because she became one of the leading people in Theosophy. She is really connected for the Theosophical movement in the 19th century. She is really big. Comes out of Rochester, but she decided to go to Alabama. So she had her Mecca up in Rochester, of course. Interesting thing here is she has connections with the Ozarks. So Ozarks know Theosophy. Really interesting. Know Theosophy. Come to Mississippi and Alabama, Theosophy starts to burgeon, not burgeon, that's too big a word, but starts to appear. So it's really interesting this occurred here, but the sage, the Osage, is an example of Theosophy in the Ozarks. And then also, too, there was a college up there where they threw out the professor because he had some Theosophical literature. Heaven forbid we talk about things that make politicians mad. Okay, and so she started this publication as well. She visited Alabama. and she met a fine younger man, and that's another sociological thing. These older women started courting younger men. And out of that came her move permanently to Alabama. Something not quite done back in that time period, really. And she died in 1917 in Washington, D.C. But her place where she moved to was in around Birmingham. And her husband, he was under the surface theosophical. He couldn't, because he was a politician, and he became a U.S. senator out of Alabama. And she married him. You can see his name right there. He could not go above, he couldn't go above and say, I'm a theosophical person. So she had to do it beneath the sea. One of the things is they had a coal mining company, cooperative in Birmingham. And they practiced some of those theosophical notions. And they even brought in an African-American contingent, which is unheard of. So it was interracial a little bit. And the other thing about William here is that he was among the first to advocate for public defenders. That comes out of that theosophical tradition. And you can see this is the African-American here. So she comes on down, she says, you got two churches. With segregation, it was really inefficient, if nothing else, because you'll have to have two of everything, right? Two of everything. And so there were two churches in this coal mining area. And she said, well, we need to fix this one up, because even if there are two, the African-American one is much less in amenities and all sorts of stuff. And so she even talked about theosophy to them and gave them she said, the sweetest toleration from these folks about their belief. But the notion that in the African-American community that she was telling them about theosophy that they had a big difference on was eternal punishment. The theosophists don't believe in eternal punishment. Actually, what they believe in that terms, again, reincarnation, is if you don't get it right, you come back until you get it right, and you just keep on coming back. Which seems like eternal punishment. And that's her house, the Raja Lodge, one of the early ones. One of the early ones right there, okay? So you may be saying to yourself, wow, this stuff, how do I not know about this? And then Vicksburg had one of the earliest lodges in Mississippi. And that poem that was at the front was written by James Gibson here, and I'll provide that to those of you who are interested. Keep me on time, okay? I don't want to go off time a little bit. But, and I want a lot of conversation about this stuff too, because there's some stuff in here, folks, that I'm blown away by. Anyway, this is founded in Vicksburg, and this fellow, he was just part of the scene. So he wasn't a transplant like Josephine was. He was part of the Vicksburg scene. He was prominent. He was a lawyer and poet. Well, I don't know if you call him a poet. I read his stuff, and it's not good. But he thought he was. This is not his poetry, but this is how people reacted to theosophy as people started to encounter it around the country. And the issue is here, that's fine, you being theosophical, you can have a little bit of education or whatever, but in the final analysis, I need my pants fixed. Okay, so that was it. And they actually put stories out there, as a matter of fact, in which they talk about when these older women, I don't know what you call them, older women, younger men, I don't remember what that's called, but that when you have those types of marriages, theosophical marriages, they are really fraught with all sorts of problems. And so they would hunt high and low for these types of marriages and just show people, if you give women this type of leadership and education, it's bound for badness. I'm not making it up, that's what they did.
You make this up?
Well, anyway, so here's a little bit about him, and you can see a picture of who he was, and he has lectures and so a cult and all these other things. A big thing in the 1890s on and up. And really, what was going on in that building that you saw was some of this stuff that you see here, lectures on the occult. Now, the occult is not quite like what you see from X-Files or whatever. Back then, an occult can mean all sorts of things. And it was, kind of filling in with the definition. And it even had a name. It was called the Siddhartha branch. So the Siddhartha branch in Vicksburg. It's not mentioned really anywhere, but what I have found here in these snippets from the media. So yeah, Vicksburg, claim to fame, because everyone says it's in Birmingham or somewhere else that it's the first one in the deep, deep south, the first branch, and they're called branches. Annie Besant was a very big leader in the Theosophical movement, and she was brilliant. Well, they're all brilliant, really. And so you should see the lines of where they're going and migrating around and getting on a circuit, kind of like Methodists, except for paranormal almost. And what they did was they would go across the nation and back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And they would hit New Orleans and whatever. But if you remember that past quote about the woman and saying there was the ether was too thick for stuff, they tried and tried and tried to make things happen outside of Vicksburg. And it didn't really stick until a little bit later. But one thing they were very smart, besides courting Masons and Order of the Eastern Star and those types of things, is that they distributed across the nation books, and literature about Theosophy. And then they also would get into letters to the editor, and so when people would say, oh my God, Theosophy, this is bad stuff, this is evil, this is satanic, or whatever, they would say, no, it isn't. It's, we think Jesus was one of our cosmic brothers, and then it would get kind of weird again. So here are some hot spots of Theosophy in both Mississippi and Alabama. And what you're going to see is in the slides to follow some of those lodges, and I'll tell you a few things about each one as I'm aware of them. But the biggest one for Mississippi was Jackson, and then the biggest one for Alabama is going to be Birmingham with Aldrich, but then Fairhope. Fairhope, that single tax colony stuff, really becomes a generator for being on the edge in terms of thinking outside the box. And so they really take to it. Yeah. I know this is Mississippi, but you made the argument, Andrew, that it was really one thing at one time. Okay, so, and we're finding this to be the case for Theosophy, as a matter of fact, that they treat it as one piece. If you were going to go lecture about Theosophy in Mississippi, then you would just go across the border and do the same thing. Same talk, same everything. In Alabama. And so Birmingham Lodge was founded in 1913, and it was active until the 60s. Now, the heyday for these lodges, or branches in Alabama and also in Mississippi, are the 1920s. Okay? But you'll see that they still have some type of activity. But Fairhope really, driving it a lot. And actually, Fairhope has this history too, because they were, the Fairhope bunch were sharing resources and consoling Graham Sumner in a Grand Range colony back in the 1890s. So they were there. And then they are also helping as generating help and whatever for Wall Hill, the single tax colony south of Memphis, for those displaced World War I vets. They were trying to make a colony up there, a single tax colony in Wall Hill. Any of you know where Wall Hill is? No? There's nothing there. Okay, but anyway, that was going on with Fairhope. Fairhope was big about that. And so they would just visit back and forth, and they were on a circuit. Not only would they come to Alabama and Mississippi, but they would go across the nation. It became kind of like a professional circuit riding experience for these people. Gulfport, this is that lodge. Now this fellow here, Winfield Wardlow Cox, MD, became like the president of that lodge, or that branch, and he was also a 32nd Mason. Oh my God, if you ever get, between if you find out on your own, or if I actually come out with a book about these things, the editorial back and forth between Dr. Cox and the people in Gulfport about Theosophy is amazing. How, we talk about internet trolls now, they were trolling big time back then. But he was the president of Gulfport Lodge, and again, the book's going around. We're out of time, we're getting out of time.
We got about a minute.
Okay, I'll go through and just show you some Jackson stuff. You're going to see 1927s. This is that period. I'm just blabbering too much about this. The thing here, folks, about the Jackson Lodge, Earl Johnston, Sr., or someone else who's named Earl Johnson. That's an important name if you know anything about the Sovereignty Commission. Greenwood had one. And this is at Lodge. Now, Clarion Ledger was pretty even keeled about this. Most of the papers were too. But finally in the 30s, they came out, and there you go. You got this exotic Far Eastern thing, black magic rules, and it's the educated people and women and whatnot going on. Other lodges, past Christian and Meridian. They had 2 radio stations. One was out of New Orleans, the other was out of Birmingham. And it lasted to pretty much the 60s. And declined, but here's the last thing I'll say. I thought it was done for in the 60s. But in the 70s, I'm talking about counterculture, a lot of hippie stuff going on in Jackson. But one of the things in 71 seems to be a pivotal year in counterculture in Jackson, was the Holy Order of Mans. And I don't know what that acronym stands for right at the moment. I've lost my memory. But it had UFO tendencies, and these people came into Jackson, and they were influenced by their leader, who was a Theosophist. And so as far as I could tell, it lasted a year. And they went around calling themselves sisters and brothers and whatever, and the cosmic brothers come down again and all that stuff. And that's their symbol right there. I'm done.
All right, everyone, as we get this pulled up and rolling, I'll go ahead and kind of get started with a little bit of background on my research. So I am presenting on the violent racial history of Poplarville, Mississippi, small town in the southeast part of the state, if you're not sure where it's located, and specifically how its most heinous lynching, what journalist Jerry Mitchell called the last classic lynching in the state, the lynching of Mack Charles Parker, took place, and how we've forgotten it. Not just the larger historical community and narrative, but also just the citizens of Poplarville, Mississippi have also forgot it. And I know that well because Poplarville just happens to be my hometown. It is working out? Yeah. Perfect. All right, so it is not out of line to say that Mississippi, or that the United States had a lynching epidemic through the 19th and mid-20th centuries. The Equal Justice Initiative claims 4,084 lynchings from 1877 to 1950, while the NAACP uses a little broader definition and interpretation of lynching, and they claim 4,743 from 1882 to 1968. But what is consistent, regardless of the definition and interpretation, is that Mississippi led the nation in lynchings during those time periods. Not only did Mississippi lead the nation in number of lynchings, but they also had some of the highest profile lynchings. The murders of Emmett Till and James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman are still heavily featured and covered in the media and in historical circles. Cities like Macomb and Natchez are well known for their record of racial violence, but tucked away in southeast Mississippi is a small town that, for its size, should be much more well known for its racially violent past. And that town is Poplarville, Mississippi, just about 30 miles southeast of here. As the bottom marker in the bottom right indicates, the city was founded in 1884 and has been relatively small since its inception. It had just over 2,800 citizens as of the 2020 census. In spite of its size, however, the small town has become was home to a significant number of lynchings during its time, making it a statistical outlier, with one of those lynchings in particular receiving considerable media coverage. So it's great to say that it was well, not great, but it is a strong statement to say that it was a statistical outlier and not back that up. So I decided to back that up. So what I did using the Red Record Project was I looked at the size of cities in both 1890 and then again in 1960 and counted the number of lynchings that took place in those cities during that time period. Cities, again, like we mentioned, Macomb, Natchez, known for their racially violent history. It's kind of hard to see on the screen, but at the time, Macomb had a population, especially in 1960, of about 12,000 people. Natchez was at about 25,000 people. Poplarville had the same number of lynchings as those two cities, yet it had a tenth of the population of Natchez, and then just Macomb having 6 times the population. Same number of lynchings in this small town. So what I want to do now, before we get into kind of the media coverage and how we've forgotten these names, I want to look at the racial violent history of Poplarville, which starts in 1884, not too long after the city was founded, when Jordan Parker was accused of derailing a train. Parker claimed that the train that ran through had killed some of his livestock, so he derailed the train allegedly. A mob of people, of over 100 people, which is over half the size of Poplarville at that time, traveled from Meridian to Poplarville to abduct Jordan Parker and shoot him and hang him afterwards. They quote unquote left 8 pounds of lead in his body after he was lynched. Historian Robert Thurston confirmed that in all likelihood, a white man convicted of the same crime would have been given benefit of the doubt and freed. 25 years later, we have Pink Willis. Pink Willis is accused of accosting a local sheriff's daughter. The most damning evidence against Pink Willis was that the boot tracks at the scene of the crime allegedly matched his. He was abducted by a crowd of several hundred men who overpowered the sheriff on duty. He was abducted, shot, and hung. It is not a coincidence that just 2 years earlier, Mississippi Governor James K. Vardaman opened his 1907 campaign for governor in the city, advocating for lynching and burning Negroes if necessary to protect homes. Then just 9 years later, we have incident number 3 with Claude Singleton, who's accused of murdering a train foreman who tried to throw him off a train he was illegally riding on. Singleton was arrested, tried, found guilty, and lynched in less than 24 hours. In a scene that should sound all too familiar by now, a crowd of nearly 100 people forced the sheriff to turn over the keys so Singleton could be abducted and murdered. Conveniently, the sheriff couldn't recognize any members of the mob. And then lastly, in 1955, the most infamous of Poplarville's lynchings occurred when Mack Parker was abducted from the jail in Poplarville and shot and thrown over the Pearl River Bridge that connects rural Pearl River County with Bogalusa, Louisiana. Parker was accused of raping June Walters, although Walters was adamant that she never gave a positive identification of Parker. A crowd of several dozen men showed up at the jail cell to abduct Parker. Again, overpowering the sheriff, taking the key, opening the cell. A considerable manhunt ensued to find the body after they had thrown it over the bridge that eventually included over 60 FBI agents. That's 60 plus FBI agents in a town that had less than 2,000 citizens. That eventually produced a 356-page report that positively identified both abductors and murderers. Local Judge Dale Say refused to allow the FBI report as evidence in the case to try to build a case against Parker's abductors. So what I did after kind of tracing the contextual history of Poplarville's racial violence is I went to newspapers.com because I wanted to use a single source so it could be compared fairly across the 4 lynchings to look at the media coverage that was received. So what I did was I looked up the person's name and the year the lynching occurred as well as the 2 following years. And that's what I have charted out here. What is one thing to kind of pay attention to as we go is where Mississippi ranks on covering their own lynching history in newspapers. So what you see here is decent coverage over the 3-year span for the murder of Jordan Parker. Pennsylvania, for some reason, taking particular interest in Parker's lynching. Nope, you're good. That is information I need. So I do have some clippings from papers from newspapers.com, though. This is from the New Orleans Weekly Times, as well as a paper in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and then an article from the New York Times. So large papers covering the lynching of Jordan Parker. Then we skip forward to Pink Willis. We are now getting coast-to-coast coverage. Wouldn't say necessarily the entire nation, but fairly close to it. New York and Pennsylvania leading the way. Mississippi, you can see, starting to fall further down the list. We have papers from Knoxville, or excuse me, the Hattiesburg Daily News, Little Rock newspaper, and the LA Times. So again, considerable media coverage. Singleton's is a little bit of an outlier in that it does not get the same media coverage that the other 3 receive. Lower numbers. What you can see is that Mississippi now out of the top 5 of covering its own racial violence. Surprise, surprise. But we do still have articles in large cities such as Knoxville, Nashville, and then maybe less so a large city, but still showing the distance in Waterton, Wisconsin that covered Singleton's lynching. And then what you'll see is kind of the drastic difference in those 3 compared to the lynching of Mack Parker, which had over 8,000 articles written in this 3-year span. And then saying it is coast to coast and nationwide news is a misnomer because this is an international news story. I found newspapers from Germany, from France, that covered Mack Parker's lynching. We have front page coverage on the Clarion Ledger, from the Black Dispatch in Oklahoma, papers in Pittsburgh, as well as front page spread on the New York Age, another prominent black newspaper in New York. So this is a well-covered lynching in Mississippi history, in United States history, clearly at the time. Yet it's one that the citizens of Poplarville do not know about, myself included. I know I did not learn about this lynching until I arrived at college, despite living the majority of my adult or my teenage life in Poplarville. And it's not just me. I've interviewed other people that live in Poplarville, and it's the same story repeatedly. Linda Whitchurch, a little bit older than I was, went to high school in Poplarville, went to Pearl River Community College afterwards, which is, of course, in Poplarville, if you didn't know, and states that she had never heard of Mack Charles Parker until she and I had that conversation. Another unnamed resident of Poplarville said they were well into their early adulthood before they heard about Mack Charles Parker. As is unsurprising, it's a little bit of a different story in the black community in Poplarville. Anthony Hales Jr. is a couple years older than I. We went to high school together. And as you can see, it's not taught in the schools there. Maybe it's a different story now. I have my doubts about that. But it's a cautionary tale told within families for black men when they get to a certain age. So what my research is going to do from here forward, this is kind of the start of my research, setting the context and starting to explore the reasons we don't know who Mack Charles Parker is. And in doing so, I reached out to Anthony Hales Jr.'s father, Anthony Hales Sr., who is a city supervisor. He was our city alderman. He's been a county supervisor for over 20 years and is a leader in the black community in Poplarville. And he told me these two stories that really stood out. One was when he heard through the grapevine that there was another member in the community that knew some details about the lynching that he could try to bring forward. And you see the response that he was given when he approached them about trying to tell that story. He also told me a lengthy story, which I've taken some excerpts from, about some more progressive individuals in the past 10 years that have looked at getting a potential civil rights marker in Poplarville to Mack Charles Parker. But at the end of the day, he said, as a supervisor, as a city alderman, he had to represent the constituents that voted for him. And when he went to his community to ask if it was something they were interested in, you see the answer. So with a black community that doesn't want to open old wounds, apparently, and a white community that is all too happy to pretend like this never existed, it's not that surprising to see why we have forgotten Mack Charles Parker. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Al. Well, I'd like to open up the floor now to questions, and we have one in the back there. Let me
Mr. Allen, are the Parkers related?
From all the research I've seen, there's no relation between Jordan and Mack Charles Parker. If it is, it's somewhat of a distance thing, a distant relation, which in Poplarville, not all too uncommon for some of their last names to not be related. Plenty of Wheats in Poplarville that I will not claim. So as far as I know, there is no relation between the two families, or at least not one that I've found thus far.
I have a question in regards to Mack Charles Parker. In your research, did you find that a group of men left Bible study and went down to Pearl River County and removed Mack Charles Parker out of his jail cell? And could it be that Poplarville was the home of the notorious Theodore Bilbo, who was a segregationist and racist? The reason why you all don't want to honor him, because he is honored at the Southern Poverty Law Center Museum, where they have all the martyrs of the Civil Rights Movement. And we will come down from Hattiesburg and put up a marker if we have to. I think he deserved that.
You will not find any opposition to me to Parker getting a marker in Poplarville, because that's really my goal once I get my research done, is to hopefully finally work with the community there to get that done. It is it's no surprise that Bilbo being from Poplarville is where this occurred. Vardaman did not start his campaign in 1907 in Poplarville by coincidence. That was a chosen choice for where he was starting his campaign. As far as the people who lynched and abducted Parker, they came from all over throughout the county. If you read, cannot recommend enough, if you want more of the details of Parker's actual lynching and story, Blood Justice by Howard Speed is a phenomenal book where I started my research. He actually got people that were in the lynch mob to talk to him when they wouldn't even talk to the FBI. So I don't know what kind of magic he pulled to make this work, but it's a phenomenal book. And there were people who literally went to dinner at local diners just to wait until the set time for them to leave, go back to the prison in Poplarville, which is still the courthouse today, where they abducted Parker.
Have you looked in the J.P. Coleman collection to read some of the responses from the pictures and some of the responses that was written to the governor?
I have indeed, thanks primarily to some of my great coworkers who have pointed me that direction. Truthfully, research for this project has been so easy working at MDAH because I just have to walk downstairs to the archives to do 90% of my research, so it's kind of a cheat code, to be honest. But there's been a lot of that, and then I'm starting to get more outreach from the community as they learn about my research. I have a friend from high school that got her PhD in history that provided me with a letter her grandmother wrote to Time magazine where she was just so offended that they would besmirch the good name of Poplarville, Mississippi by saying all these terrible things about the town because an accused rapist got murdered, and the kind of narrative that would go along with that.
I'm sorry. This is a question for Thomas. I know it was like a really common stereotype back then that like African Americans were into like ghosts or what they would call haunts. Like in a lot of the WPA slave narratives, one of the questions that people would always ask was, "Have you ever seen a ghost?" or something like that. Was that something that the Theosophy people tried to use to connect with African Americans?
Well, it would have been a mutual affinity for sure. There's some sociological studies about this kind of, there are two types of paranormal believers. Those who tend to be of a faith, the Christian faith tend to believe in angels and things which are paranormal, believe in some of those things, ghosts.
Right.
And then those who are agnostic and atheistic and whatever, they too have some paranormal tendencies. They tend to be towards UFOs and Bigfoot and whatnot. And so the point of all this is the Theosophists were inclusive. They would have taken any type of folks, because those all have numbers, really.
Whatever ropes you in.
Whatever, and two, they weren't going to bring in, I should say this, they weren't going to bring in anyone that was not inclusive. So they did have some higher ideals about, beloved community and things of that nature.
So for Dr. Kersen as well, I saw some of the dates that you were pointing out for the rise of Theosophy in kind of late 1800s going into the 1920s, and spiritualism takes a big rise up the chain there. But thanks to people like Houdini and other major public faces kind of debunking the spiritualists, it kind of falls down. But you show that Theosophy continues growing in the 1900s and all the way up into the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Why is that?
Well, they were able to write irony and contradiction very well, the Theosophists were. And I'll give you a short story. Columba Krebs is her pseudonym. I won't give you a real name, but her father, Stanley Krebs, a renowned PhD in psychology, in the 19th century, when he was getting fame, he would go around and debunk all these people who were talking. They would go in a trance and talk and write, do automatic writing is what it was called, and he would debunk it. But on the other hand, he would believe some really far-fetched notions himself, and so they didn't really, somehow they didn't see the irony or the contradiction, and they could kind of just live with it, maybe compartmentalize their identities in various ways. So in one sense, he was going around debunking paranormal activities, yet him and a number of folks, and some early sociologists, as a matter of fact, on one hand, debunking all that, and on the other, being a part of paranormal communities and such. So it's a good question. I'm not sure how you come to a resolution on that. They didn't seem to have too much of an issue with it.
Thank you.
How much pushback did you get from the Masons when you were writing this book, Thomas?
Pushback from whom?
The Masons.
The Masons, the Masonic Order.
Well, they don't know about it, so I'm. Here's the deal. I talked about communes a couple of years ago. I was thinking, okay, that was kind of like a dead fish, not really a lot of people excited about that. So I said to myself on this one, I'm either going to get written out on a poll, which would be cool, or you guys will really like it. So you're going to spread it about, and maybe some of these Masons and folks will learn about it. That'd be the people who write me out on a poll, probably. No, but they really, the Order of the Eastern Star and Masons, a lot of their beliefs coincide with some of the Theosophical notions as well. This sort of spiritual dimension to Christianity. He's talking about Protestantism in those three brands there, but there's a whole wide of spiritual Christianity, even now. And so we just think it's in the 60s where you can blend in Far Eastern philosophy and Christianity, or meditation and Baptism, which is interesting. So yeah, I haven't had any pushback, but we'll see.
We have a question back here.
So some of those beautiful buildings that you showed, you might not know, but do any of those buildings still exist with Mississippi?
Yes, some of them do exist. The Jackson Lodge. The Jackson Lodge is still there, from what I understand. I think I've seen it. It's like, but when you see one building, when you see buildings with that type of architecture, they kind of start to look alike. But I think that one in Jackson for sure is there. The Vicksburg one, I intend to go down and take a look at that. Make sense that these things are around.
Wasn't the Vicksburg building originally the Jewish community center?
Well, more than that, I don't know the answer to that, but I will say it was a community center for all sorts of people. It was the go-to. In fact, all these places, and that's really cool about this, is they were welcoming. They were not hostile to the Theosophists all the way up through the 20s. And so they gave them the local Chamber of Commerce and other types of buildings to bring in the lecturers. And the Vicksburg Community Place, I forget the name of what they called it, but so they were using these public buildings to have these theosophy and occultic lectures. It really swept through the South, these talks. Maybe it will again.
Drew, do you have any understanding of what the history of interracial church attendance in Mississippi looks like? I mean, was there any of that in the 19th century before the 20th century?
So if we look back into specifically, and I'll speak specifically of Jackson, because that's where a lot of my research as it continues, the case study I use is First Presbyterian Church of Jackson, but there's three denominations within Jackson. As far as we can tell from an interracial worship standpoint, the closest that we could get to is the connection between Mount Helm Baptist Church and First Baptist Baptist Church. And that would be the earliest connection of those. Mount Helm is birthed out of those members who were enslaved, the enslaved population from First Baptist. But that is the earliest we could find. For the most part, I mean, as we see today, most of these congregations are going to remain segregated along throughout the entirety of the 19th century and on through most of the 20th century.
Come here and then,
I was just in that regard going to ask if you had anything to say in the relationship of the holiness movement and the church presentation that you did, and the early days of the Pentecostal churches in California and the Azusa Street movement were integrated. Was there any holiness movement?
So because most of my research, again, focuses on that very narrow definition of Southern white Protestantism, Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian, that's where all of it. I do know that there is definitely some influx as the Azusa movement, as it begins to head east, that there are collections, but again, that's not where my expertise is.
Alan, I just want to make a comment that might help your research. When I was working on my book on Hazel Brennan Smith, she commented on the Mack Parker lynching and the Holmes County Herald, which was put into business to put her out of business, also would make comments about the Mack Parker lynching and attack her for, criticizing Mississippi and bringing another, black guy to the state, and that might be an area you want to look into. Thomas, I've always been curious, and it sort of goes along with what Andrew was talking about, with evangelical groups that are taking the Bible literally, they are holding a hard line on slavery during this period. Have either of you come across groups off the beaten path that we're not going in a biblical literalist perspective, and thus it didn't affect how they looked at black-white relations? In other words, have you come across any, for lack of a better word, liberal religious groups or atheistic groups, that did, rejected the Bible and in turn rejected the idea of slavery is, ordained by God or by nature? I'm just curious. I've always wondered if anybody's done any research on that.
Yeah, Unitarianism comes to mind right away, and especially with Jeff Davis's brother. He tried to create a colony based on some Unitarian ideas, and I forget the guy's name, Lead Slave, kind of follows some of those notions as well. But Unitarianism comes to mind. Of course, Theosophy, where they were doing that. I think what you really, even the Unitarians were fighting it, interestingly. The Universalists, they were probably part of that whole scene that you're talking about. So they were fighting these issues. I know that there's a Universalist church at our home in Ellisville, and it has a long history. The church up in Jackson, the Unitarian Church, was one of the first integrated churches in the state. So, yeah, Unitarianism comes to mind right away.
Yeah, I don't think I necessarily have any that I can think that I can point directly to and say this is an example of that. But I can definitely say, there was a clear, that while Christianity definitely, and biblical interpretation divided, that there were those who simply just didn't engage. They had their own reasons for their own opinions, but specifically within, especially Mississippi. I think Judge Warden, as he arrives in Mississippi, he describing being at the Capitol. It's a frontier. Mississippi is what we think of the Wild West. And so, in many ways, I think that there's a degree that there's not this sophistication. I think that's often projected especially because of the financial, wealth that Mississippi held. So no, I don't have any specific examples necessarily.
All right, well, we have a few more minutes if there are any other questions for our speakers. But if not, I'm sure that they would be more than happy to continue speaking one-on-one with folks. I think we've got a few minutes break here before our next session.
Guys, there is coffee in the back of this room. So